Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Black Irish, some notes on becoming a trend. I'm thrilled to have Kimberly DaCosta here to talk with us. I think it's going to be a really fascinating conversation. So on behalf of Irish Studies at Berkeley, welcome. And let me say a few words of introduction for Kim. So Professor Kimberly DaCosta is a sociologist interested in racial inequality and in particular the contemporary production of racial boundaries. She teaches courses at NYU Gallatin on race in different societies, social mobility, consumerism, and the commercialization of intimate life. Her book, Making Multiracials, State, Family, and Market in the Redrawing of the Color Line, came out with Stanford University Press in 2007. It explores the cultural and social underpinnings of the movement to create multiracial collective identity in the United States. She's currently writing on how interracial extended kin relationships speak to the questions of interracial empathy, care, and politics. So Kim will talk now for about 30 minutes and then we'll have Q&A. So please post your questions in the chat function and we'll be delighted to have them. So if you'd like to take it away, Kim.
Okay, thank you so much, Catherine, and thank you to Julia for facilitating today's talk. This is so weird on Zoom, but we'll just do it. Okay, so by way of kind of explaining my topic today, I thought I would locate myself a bit. So that you know, I was born in Boston. I'm the fourth of my parents' 6 kids. And I was raised in one of its suburbs in the 70s and 80s. My father is a Black American, my mother's an Irish American. My great-grandparents, John and Mary Ellen Gorman, came from Galway, and my other great-grandparents, James and Annetta Rafferty, came from Sligo at the end of the 19th century. My grandfather worked in a laundry, while my great-uncles and great-grandfather were bricklayers, and the favorite son, my grandmother's brother, George, whom we only ever called Father George, was a Catholic priest. As many of you likely know, where I grew up in the south of Boston was then and still is one of the most heavily Irish regions in the country. The South Shore of Massachusetts is sometimes referred to as the Irish Riviera, a place where the Irish were demographically, culturally, and politically dominant. And that dominance showed itself in neighborhood family names. On our street alone, the McClains, my family, was surrounded by Druins, Beeseys, McLaughlins, Higginses, Sweeneys, Bulgers, and Melvins. Nearly all of us made our first communions at Immaculate Conception or Our Lady of the Rosary. We abstained from meat eating on Fridays and were occasionally treated to soda bread, corned beef, and cabbage. By junior high, it seemed all the girls were sporting clatter rings. It was Irishness, suburban American style, observable in ancestry, ritual, and religion, and exaggerated, often obnoxiously so, on St. Patrick's Day. From my child's point of view, Irishness was synonymous with whiteness. So heavily Irish was my context that it came as something of a shock when I began to consciously realize that not all white people are Irish. But importantly, never did I think the converse, that not all Irish are white. And while this might sound odd, given that I have the evidence of my family and our experience to support such a claim, the boundaries Irish people drew around being Irish tended to exclude people like me. In part, this was due to a broader and specifically American logic of racial categorization that bounds Blackness and whiteness in relation to each other, the presence of one negating the other. One drop of Black blood made one Black, and categorically, definitionally, not white. When the Irish became white in 20th century America, they did so in part through upholding this racial logic. Coupled with this were the particularly strong notions of what Irish looks like. My blue eyes might have helped to authenticate me as Irish. My afro disqualified me. So in part, the whiteness of Irishness was related to an explicit anti-Blackness. Boston has never been especially hospitable to Black people, but the 70s and 80s were particularly ugly. school desegregation and busing of Black students into Irish South Boston put violent and racist sentiment of some Irish Americans on display, and the nightly news. It scared me, and those events and many other exclusions, big and small, profoundly shaped me and my relationship to Irishness. And though indeed I am Black and Irish, ancestrally and culturally, I attended the same schools, practiced the same rituals, and knew as much, or let's face it, as little about Ireland as did my Irish American peers, Irishness remained white. And so it's from that context that I encounter the emerging dialogue that's been developing, exploring Black Irish connections. And I hope gives some grounding for the title of my talk, which is #BlackIrish, some notes on becoming a trend. The #BlackIrish references the ways that public discussions of the experience of being Black and Irish are emerging on social media. And I'll describe a bit about that in a minute. But it's also meant to encompass the dialogue developing in civil society as well, through conversations like the ones that NYU's Ireland House has been sponsoring all year in a series called Black, Brown, and Green Voices, which is meant to broaden the understanding of who's Irish through conversations with mixed-race Irish in the diaspora. This conversation is also happening through the soft diplomacy of Ireland's Department of Foreign Affairs, which has been instrumental in creating the newly established African-American Irish Diaspora Network, which is meant to explore ancestral, cultural, and political links, past and present, between Blacks and Irish. Recent celebrations, both in the US and Ireland, commemorating Frederick Douglass's time in Ireland and the bonds he forged with Catholic liberator Daniel O'Connell and the Irish people, and that have been elaborated through the work of historian Christine Keneally, are also part of that historical discussion, of this emergent discussion. But the trend that is the Black Irish is also about demographics, most specifically the changing demography of Ireland, as it's become an immigrant rather than emigrant society. Indeed, roughly 17% of the current Irish population was born outside of Ireland. Ireland has seen correspondingly significant increases in ethnic diversity, interracial marriage, and mixed race identification. Blacks make up about 1.4% of the Irish population, and other, including mixed, is the fastest growing ethnic category, with 1.5% of the population identifying as such in 2016. Also, in 2011, about 17.5% of marriages were between mixed couples, defined as an Irish person married to a non-Irish person and or married to a non-white ethnic person. The numbers are even higher for younger married couples, those under 30, where it's estimated about 25% are mixed couples. So it's in this context that #BlackIrish has been forged. So what do I mean by that? Literally, I mean the #BlackIrish on Instagram, which I've been following for quite some time. And for much of that time, that thread has depicted the Black Irish of black hair and blue eyes, with the occasional post by a mixed race Irish Black person. Occasionally, one might see a post by someone of African descent who had immigrated to Ireland, but for the most part, no. But in the wake of George Floyd's murder by police in the spring of 2020, a different #Black and Irish, has more explicitly centered the dialogue on what it means to be Irish and Black today, be it by way of passport, immigration, ancestry, or culture, in which people are sharing their experiences of what it's been like to grow up in Ireland as a person of African descent. They're at once asserting their Irishness, their belonging and right to belong to the country of their birth or upbringing or recent migration. And they're also shining a light on the difficulties of doing so in the face of racialized understandings of Irishness that are predicated on whiteness. Their tagline, if you check it out, is "One country, many voices." It's not actually, I'll tell you a little bit about them, but it's interesting. It's not actually obvious who all of the organizers are, as they don't tend to emphasize their individual identities. They appear to be mostly young people in their 20s, maybe 30s. And as a group, they're both mixed race Irish, Irish of African descent, native born, and immigrant. On the page itself, they collect stories of the experiences of Black people in Ireland. And this quote from an Alison from Dublin is a fairly representative set of common themes. She writes, "I don't recall pondering my or others' skin color till we moved to Dublin in the mid-80s, when a random kid shouted the N-word at us. My racism-free bubble burst. Microaggressions are common, assumptions based on my tan, non-Irish surname, some jaw-dropping Black stereotype remarks, the novelty factor, invasive hair touching, years tied up to avoid this, and at number one, no, but where are you really from? A question that implies your Irishness is disputable, forced to repeatedly qualify your existence." Another, Calm McGovern, writes, "I am proud to be Irish. For me, it's the best country in the world, but even the best things have its flaws and constantly need to strive for better. Growing up, I faced racism from primary school, where I had come home to ask my mom what an N was because I was called it in school. As any mom would do, she jumped in to protect me and my brother and went to the principal, who responded, 'They better get used to it.' I've been abused all the way through education and even had college staff members being racist in front of me. I've been a target of racial abuse on social media, shouted at in the street, and even chased in town. My heart breaks as I know I have got off lightly when I hear the stories of friends and others who have had great courage to share their stories over the last few weeks. On the other side, my best mate, when I was young, had to ask my mom why they were saying things because he didn't see a difference. My college swiftly gave the staff the boot when I brought the issue to them. I've seen people jump in to stop racism and seen support online the last few weeks, not to mention how powerful the march was in Ireland. 15 years on, and yes, I'm used to it, but no more kids should be told to get used to it. No person should be made to feel lesser because of how much pigment is in their skin. It's time to stamp this out together, no matter what your color is." I selected these partly because they're representative, I think, not that I've done a thoroughly systematic analysis, but they seem to be systematic, representative of what's on the page generally, what Black Irish people are talking about. And I have to say, it all reads very familiar to this Boston-born Black Irish woman. And I will add, and apparently to my sister also, because when I was looking for this quote, I noticed that my sister had liked it on Instagram. I didn't even know she was following this. But that's an aside. I must say that at times I feel quite sad reading how similar the stories are to mine and many others that we in the US told a generation ago. Where are you from? No, where are you really from? Is that your mother? You're Irish? No. What are you really? The various forms of racial abuse, from touching your hair to the N-word. It's very familiar, not just to me, but to many of the people that I studied when working on my book on multiracials in the US. And while I don't want to elide the differences between the US and Ireland in terms of our racial histories and current problems, neither do I want to suggest that there's been no positive movement in the last generation on questions of racial inclusion in either place. In both the US and Ireland, a deep and consequential stigma attached to mixed race births has given way to more acceptance. For mixed race Black Irish in the 50s and 60s, you can read consistently stories of racial abuse and exclusion from football star Paul McGrath's descriptions of his own life, experiencing a constant struggle to be accepted as Irish, or the horrific abuse suffered by mixed race Black Irish children in mother and baby homes that has been so bravely described by women like Rosemary Adasser and Christine Buckley. Today, largely through the organization building of people like Lorraine Maher, through her organization, I Am Irish, that's based in London, there is far more recognition of mixed race people as part of Irish culture. The current, I believe, Rose of Tralee is a Black Irish young woman, and Black Irish celebrities like Ruth Negga enjoy fame and popularity. The same sort of opening to and destigmatization of interracial intimacy and cultural representation, Obama probably being the best example, have also happened in the United States. And yet, so much more work needs to be done, as the present crisis in the US makes clear, from the killing of George Floyd that sparked the Black and Irish hashtag, to say nothing of our problems with hyperincarceration in the society. Ireland, of course, has its struggles, and maybe we can talk about this, the ending of birthright citizenship, for example, and the way migrants are treated under new regimes. It strikes me, though, that this dialogue on being Black Irish is an absolutely necessary interlude to help navigate a transition in Ireland to a more inclusive and expanded vision of Irishness, one that reflects what is already true, that Ireland is a multicultural society. But I want to say that this dialogue is being forged transnationally, not just through social media, but in the kinds of networks that I had described before, both at NYU and through the Irish consulate, is immensely interesting to me, because on the one hand, for a very personal reason, as a mixed race Black Irish person in the United States, I didn't know anyone like me except my siblings, right? And in part, that's because the relevant distinction in the United States wasn't Black and white, specific white ethnicities, but Blackness and whiteness, and the particular stigma about that in the US context. But to see a kind of emerging group of people is kind of that share my identity, and much of my experience is particularly delightful personally. But I'm also cautious about how this forging of Irish Black connections and rediscovery of an Irish Black past that I see coming out in kind of this dialogue, it gives me a little bit of pause. And by that, I mean, much of the discussion around rediscovering the Afro-Celtic connection in the United States is largely being talked about, and this is probably an oversimplification, so I want to couch it in those terms, is largely often legitimized, I should say, with respect to these claims about the extent of Irish ancestry that African Americans had. And you'll often see this reference with respect to Obama, Michelle Orbach, Eddie Murphy, whatever, celebrities who have Irish surnames or may know an ancestor or maybe not, or took a DNA test. And I'm particularly skeptical of the ways that thinking about history in terms of DNA, while being silent on the context, assuming that the DNA results measure anything real, but being silent about the context in which those genetic ties are forged. I also think we need to be somewhat cautious that this sort of reimagining or rediscovery of Irish Black connections doesn't become just a kind of celebration of diversity that hides what I think is a really complicated past. And in some ways, I think it's instructive to take from what some Irish scholars have written about with respect to the romance that's often ascribed to the Irish Black connection. In particular, what Diane Negro says describes as the way that Irishness seems to move between a quasi-Blackness and a politically insulated ethnic whiteness. And for her, she's interested in the implications of the way that Irishness functions as a form of identity currency and stands at the heart of so many homeland fantasies of whites. I think we should be careful about the ways that this reinvigoration of a Black Irish past doesn't paper over, as I've said before, some of these divisions that in the service of a kind of overly romantic notion of what it means to be Irish. And, oh geez, I'm just about time. I could stop a little earlier.
I would say keep going.
Okay.
Don't
Okay.
quit.
Yeah, I don't know if this is, I'm not sure how much the, people are familiar with what's going on, but I don't know, I feel also that, one interesting question we might want to ask about from an American, in particular an African-American point of view, as we sort of forge this African-American Irish diaspora, what claiming an Irish identity does for African-Americans, right? In what ways do the genealogical heritage seekers, insofar as, the romance of Irishness fuels a certain kind of fantasy for Irish Americans. Is it doing a similar thing for African Americans, and why? I guess I put that out there simply to say, as excited as I am about this emerging dialogue, because as I said before, it's not something I ever thought would happen in my lifetime, that one, I would have a chance to talk with people who experience Black Irishness in multiple ways, and that's very exciting. I also just want to understand what that project is about and what work it does politically and socially. And with that, I think I'll just leave it there and kind of maybe put that out there as a point of discussion, perhaps, and see what people want to talk about. So with that, that's just a brief intro, and let's talk.
Great, thank you so much, Kim. Such an interesting series of insights, and I'm really looking forward to questions from you guys who are in the audience. Just please do write them in the chat function, and I'll be delighted to pass them on. And maybe to start things off, I might ask you about how you think multiracial development in the US looks different to what's happening in Ireland. These are clearly, say if there's racial abuse, even like in verbal or even physical terms at times in both Ireland and America. And this is really troubling to hear about for me, because I think of, as an Irish person, I think of that we're in some ways free, we're free of the kind of horrible history of America in terms of slavery, that, we ourselves experienced subjugation, we were on that side, but at the same time, this obviously does not excuse, it doesn't mean that people aren't racist now. So I suppose with that in mind, could you talk a bit about how you think the different multiracial movements look like?
Yeah, I mean, when I was writing about this organization, collective organization in the United States was beginning like in the 80s. And part of that is attributable to like a significant demographic shift, but the social context in which people were being raised. So it wasn't until 1967 that interracial marriage became legal in all American states. as hard as that may be to believe, right? But it's that sort of generation, and this is the Loving versus Virginia decision in '67, where we begin to see a rise in interracial marriage. I mean, it has a lot to do also with changing norms about claiming ethnic identities and racial identities post-civil rights movement in the United States, but also a critical mass of people reaching adulthood who also were, it's not that mixedness as such, the crossing of boundaries, sexual, and the creation of people as a result is new in any way. It's the context that's different. And the context that of relevance in the United States was a lot of people, beyond the other elements I just described, were raised with some knowledge of who their parents were, and also had a cultural connection to both sides of their family, and that this was an important element for why people came to see not just the ways racial categorization was configured in the United States, if you're not aware. For most of the 20th century, this US state did not count as such racial mixedness. You could only have one race. So you would have to choose, and socially, if not legally, if you had African ancestry, you were considered Black. In previous decades and centuries, different permutations of how of mixedness were counted by the state, but for the 20th century, no. And that was an important element of facilitating Jim Crow segregation. That context begins to change in 2000 as the state, partly through the organization of some mixed race people to challenge that, classification system, resulted in the system we have now, which does acknowledge this. In Ireland, though, the counting of mixed backgrounds is very new in the last decade or so, a little longer than that. So it in part reflecting a rather mono-ethnic society. Of course, however, part of the discussion now are the ways that are how to recover a more diverse Irish past than has been previously acknowledged. So I think what's sort of similar, though, about the Irish story and the American story, and in some ways this is what I wanted to emphasize, is sadly the intensity of anti-Blackness within Ireland. Not necessarily of African Americans. Indeed, there seems to be a sort of interest and sense of compatibility between the Irish as a post-colonial society and the struggles of African Americans. But within Ireland itself, the intensity of the stories that people like Rosemary Adasser, Christine Buckley have to tell, or Paul McGrath, or, it's very reminiscent of the kinds of stigma that people like my parents faced, or the, I think, untold, unresearched story of the number of mixed race babies given up for adoption here, precisely because of that stigma, also in the mid-20th century. So, I mean, there are other ways that I think they're different, but tell me if I should stop talking. I can't hear you, Catherine. You're on mute.
Oh, yes, don't stop. So let me read out a question or two so that you can get a chance to talk with some people here. So there's a question, we're Jamaican and wondering if anyone has looked at the Irish interface in Jamaican culture, especially in the Caribbean. And this would seem to be a major factor in the kind of Irish names of African Americans. I think this sort of Caribbean heritage Well, this is just my speculation, but also this is a really interesting one from Antoinette Chevalier. Can you comment on the movie The Commitments, if you've seen it, and how it speaks to the maybe forced alliance between Irish soul with blackness, especially around music and oppression? I mean, this is a very strange moment, right? Like the Irish are the blacks of Europe and the Dubliners are the blacks of Ireland. And what does that mean? So maybe we'll just start with those two.
Okay. So, I mean, yeah, there is some discussion, and certainly I can, sorry, I'm blanking off the top of my head of who's written specifically about Jamaica historically, but thinking about, yeah, Irish connections in Montserrat, in Barbados, in Jamaica, is certainly something that scholars are writing about. And my husband is Jamaican, and we were actually just talking about this. The understanding that, yes, many white people who are in Jamaica are Irish, of Irish descent, but it's not particularly remarked upon from his point of view. But sorry, the second question, sadly, I actually haven't seen The Commitments.
Okay, yeah, that's fine.
But I don't know. I'm curious what others think about this. Did you all see the video that was going around a bit ago over the summer? And it was a poem about how if you're Irish, you don't get to be racist. Anyone see that? Well, it was a pretty powerful one that was sort of making the rounds, that was meant to convey this idea that to invoke what you were just describing, Catherine, this sense of, as a post-colonial people, we are the blacks of Europe, right? The Irish are the blacks of Europe. And except, you know, the difficulty I have with that sort of framing is, what work does that do for the Irish, and in what ways does it elide the sort of particularities of the ways that in Ireland, particularly with respect to African migrants, people of African descent, that's not a pass. You don't get a pass for that, right? Like, you have to really investigate how it is you're treating people in your midst right now, not with some reference that, well, we're not really like that because we were the oppressed people, without understanding the ways that people are engaging in really racist, to use an overly general term, ways towards people of African descent right now. And I think, you know, reading and hearing the testimonials of young people in Ireland now, that you can't get stuck in a kind of national self-understanding as victims who've triumphed, without that sort of escapes a kind of reckoning with what's really happening on the ground in people's lives now.
Okay, there's a question from John Mundell about how certain immigrant populations in Ireland become black, so to speak, or begin to recognize their blackness due to confronting different or new forms of racialization. So he's thinking this is especially with the enormous Brazilian migrant community, and how ideals of racial democracy in Brazil, where denying blackness remains relatively easy, but this isn't possible in the context of Ireland. So that, you know, the blackness becomes suddenly a category thrust upon immigrants in Ireland, which they might evade in other countries. So countries with more complex relationships and understandings of race, such as Brazil.
Yes, sorry. Was there a question? I wasn't sure what the question was. Was there a comment or question? Sorry, I didn't.
It's kind of an observation, I think. Okay. I think the implicit question is, do you agree? Do you think this is correct?
That it's not until a context in which you become racialized in particular ways that are specific to the place in which you are, that shapes how you come to define yourself. Absolutely. We see that all over the world, really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so then there's a more general question from Janae Jackson about a strong Irish Native American Black presence in the state of Oklahoma because of its history. And she's asking if anyone is familiar with this, with work done on this culture. Sounds like a really fascinating nexus.
I'm not familiar with the specific Irish Black Native connection in Oklahoma, or who's writing about it, but the Black-white Native connection has been written about in many different contexts in the United States, particularly the southeastern United States. In sort of old mid-20th century anthropological language, they were referred to as triracial isolates. It was a way to kind of account for these pockets, small communities, generally speaking, in which, uncommon to how most people were relating in racial terms, that there was significant mixing and living among Blacks, whites, and Native peoples. That is, part of my family's story. My father's from North Carolina, near the Lumbee people. But they, through some of the dynamics that I was alluding to earlier, my father migrated along with millions of other African Americans mid-20th century to the North out of the South for more opportunity. And the relevance of being Native or maintaining a kind of mixed Indian identity wasn't really, what mattered for his life and his life chances, and fundamentally shaped how he thought of himself.
Denzel Tong,
was being Black.
In contemporary Ireland, do we see the same type of discrimination against Black immigrants and Black Irish community members that we've historically seen in the US?
Yes.
For example, redlining, racially biased policing,
local
housing
context
discrimination.
Absolutely shapes what you regard as
a really good question, and
how you think about your identity. I don't know that we have enough information. However, there's a really good book that just came out by Abun Joseph. I'm not going to remember the title, but it's Critical Race Theory with respect to labor market issues in Ireland for people of African descent. And basically what she's trying to document is racial stratification that's emerging, particularly for how African migrants are or are not able to access work. So that actually just came out, I think, last week. It would definitely be worth looking at. To the extent that we have different histories, Irish in the US, and the migration of Africans to Ireland is a relatively recent phenomenon in terms of any size. Questions of redlining, for example, I wouldn't expect to see that.
Yeah.
However, given everything that we've been reading about and the kinds of work that Abun Joseph is doing, there are problems of the ways that when we talk about racial exclusion, it's not just ideas about difference and what's better or worse or what's beautiful or not. It's also about how you prevent people from accessing opportunity. And there seems to be growing evidence of that.
I think that your point about the newness or the kind of relatively recent, let's just say migration of Black people to Ireland, I think it does maybe offer grounds for hope that because of centuries of kind of entrenched racism in the US, it's so difficult to change. But with this kind of emerging discourse of the experience of Black Irish people, that, you know, exposes the kind of the racism that they encounter in their daily lives in Ireland, despite whatever self-exonerating images Irish people have of white Irish people have of themselves. That this kind of, that with social media now, with this kind of contemporary sort of powerful awareness and desire to change, that this there could be maybe there's grounds for hope in that. Yeah, I'm trying to be like optimistic in some kind of naive way here, but you know, I wonder if there's we're kind of, the world, the social world is being created in these terms right now, or kind of recreated.
I think there's a lot. I mean, I'm gonna, whatever. I don't consider myself naive, but I also find hopeful the kinds of ways that people are trying to come together to forge something better. What I think is really interesting about what's happening in Ireland now, that is very different from what happened in the US around these questions, particularly the mixed race stuff, is that when people in the US began to talk collectively and to try to assert themselves, both in forming organizations or how they were classified, their movements were met with a lot of suspicion by African Americans, and with good reason, because of the problems associated with Black subordination in the US. So the assumption was, if people were trying to be recognized as mixed race, they necessarily didn't want to be Black. They were trying to escape Blackness. And so that sort of kind of created a kind of fissure. And by the way, movements around mixedness in the United States weren't just Black, white people. They were also heavily Asian white people collectively working together. In what's going on with Ireland now, what I found so interesting is the organizers of this collective, they're both mixed race and Irish of African descent, right? Not necessarily mixed race. And there's a real sense, again, all preliminary, that they understand that what they have in common and what is really important to confront now is the anti-blackness that shapes both of their experience, right? And that's, I think, been more of a challenge in the United States. To me, this is very hopeful. It really is. And I really hope it continues. Yeah. Posted a query about commercials and visual culture in Ireland and sort of the use of Black Caribbean characters, particularly in Guinness commercials. Yeah, I mean, I think the sort of ways that it's not just in Ireland, but, well, I don't know if you've read anything but Carmen Kuling and Karen Cohane's work on globalizing Ireland. God, I'm forgetting the title. Cosmopolitan Ireland has a really good analysis of the ways that representation in popular culture around sort of a kind of multiculturalism, but in particular, they don't comment on Black Caribbean characters per se, but they do talk about the mixed race figure increasingly being used in advertisements to sort of signal a kind of cosmopolitan globalizing Ireland, and attaching that to products, which is meant to convey a certain kind of allure. It's something we see here as well. When I was growing up, you would have never seen an image of an interracial couple or an ambiguously raced body in a context that would suggest where that mixedness came from to sell anything. In fact, that would be the way to kill your product, right? but we see a change in the 90s where, again, to sort of capture these sorts of the symbolism of, you know, cosmopolitan globalization, you know, being a person from out, you know, the new, the trendy, the global, that increasingly we began to see these images to sell things like, you know, Benetton's probably one of the first examples to do this, but then to move kind of into a domestic space to sell things like Verizon, you know, where you'd suddenly see mixed race families being depicted. Again, helpful for sort of conveying this idea of connectivity, particularly with telecommunications. Now it's so common, I don't even notice it anymore. But I do think these images, and they can obviously be problematic. Guinness is called the black stuff. I didn't know that. And they're using a black character. You know, sometimes it's clumsy and awful. But these sorts of representations do a kind of work. So I'll have to check out that particular ad.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I just came back from 2 months in Ireland, and I felt like there was a huge effort on the national television channels to represent people of different ethnicities and to interview, you know, mixed race politicians, to like feature people, to really do the kinds of things that, you know, say, Grace, you were talking about that needs to be done. I mean, and I think that calling Guinness the black stuff, you know, Irish people have been calling it that for a very long time, but to include people of African descent in that kind of frame of reference is a real gesture of it's an attempted gesture of inclusion, I think. And so while it's still Guinness, you know, and they're still trying to sell things, at the same time, that kind of discourse really reaches people, so that it might be doing multiple things at the same time. Yeah.
I actually wanted to respond to a question. I just opened the chat and realized that there's questions here. That Gia had asked about education, the education system. Are there any movements afoot for changes around the discussion of the origin of Blacks in Ireland? Actually, I think in the Cosmopolitan Ireland book I referenced, there's a really interesting discussion about changes to educational curricula to be responsive to the sort of multicultural Ireland. So I would absolutely check that out. And Zelia Asava has a recent, I think her discussions are helpful also in thinking about what needs to be broadened in popular culture generally, but also I believe she talks about education. I'm happy to send you this stuff if you email me some of these citations. So yeah, and in short, I think those discussions are happening. How much traction they'll get, I don't know. Yeah.
All right, so we're at 1 o'clock now, and we'll have to move up. Yeah, the time flew by. Thanks so much, Kim, for this fascinating discussion and for all of your questions. Yeah, I'm really grateful to you for showing up here.